And then, Heather, maybe I'll start by, okay. I'll start by introducing our class, and then you can introduce yours.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so for everybody in Waterloo, we have here the Masters of Environmental Policy program here at Grenfell Campus Memorial University. And this is our ENVP 6002 class, which is our research design and methods class. So we're working through developing everyone's research projects and including discussing ways to share and mobilize the findings from everyone's thesis research when they're finished. So the policy briefs is an important avenue, I think, to talk about for our policy program. And we have a snowstorm here in Corner Brook today and yesterday, so campus has been shut down. But fortunately, we were able to have some assistance from a St. John's campus to get the technology going, and everybody came out and braved the weather anyway. Campus is supposed to open in an hour, but most of us are here. Some of the students are online, though, so we have Trishita and Wayne joining us from their offices or homes. And we also have a couple of our Grenfell faculties and staff here with us who have relevant experience. So you see Wade Bowers on the screen. Wade Bowers is a professor here at Grenfell, but he also spent a year, I guess it is, Wade, as Assistant Deputy Minister of Natural Resources with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador on a secondment from the university. So he's got some great firsthand experiences with how to feed research into policy. Thank you, Wade, for joining us.
You're welcome.
And then we will have Ken Carter join us as well. Ken is the director of our Office of Engagement here at Grenfell Campus, but he was also the director of policy for 5 years, from 2009 to 2014, with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador and their Office of Public Engagement and Rural Secretariat. So they'll both be able to provide some insights as to how policy briefs were used in their jobs after we finish our presentation. I'll pass it over to you, Heather.
Excellent. Well, hello, everyone from Waterloo. We are ECDev 604, which is a class in the Masters of Economic Development and Innovation program here. And it looks at management and policy tools for economic development and sustainability professionals. So we've been going through all the various kinds of tools that economic developers will use on a daily basis over the course of this semester. And we're quite excited to be joining in with all of you folks from Newfoundland and Labrador.
And Heather, you mentioned that your class is creating policy briefs as part of their course, isn't it?
We are. So part of their major assignment for the course is actually doing a place marketing strategy for a community, but they will also be creating a policy brief on an economic development topic designed for their municipal councils.
Great. Okay. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now, and so we'll lose everyone's faces, but and move to a presentation that Heather and I will give, and then give a couple of examples of how we've used policy briefs in the past with research, and then we'll move into a discussion on some examples from Ken and Wade. So I'll share my screen now. See if I can get this to work. Okay, do you see the slides okay, Heather?
We do.
Great. All right.
All right, so as Kelly and I already mentioned, this is the Joint Policy Brief Workshop, and we did want to start off with a quick discussion on the Canadian Regional Development Projects, because we are recording this part of the presentation. This will be publicly available as part of some of the knowledge mobilization initiatives related to a SSHRC Connections grant. And basically, the purpose of this connection grant was to look at the application and relevance of new regionalism in the Canadian context, to seek Canadian innovations in regional development, and to understand how they're evolving and how they are shared across space and networks of regional development policy and practice. So we're working now on mobilizing all of these findings across the country, and we have been given some money to hold a variety of capacity building webinars on various topics, and this is one of the topics for that research grant.
it might be worth saying that it's interesting that SSHRC does fund, which is our federal funding agency for social sciences research. They do have these grants available for mobilizing research. So there was a 5-year research project that we did, but then they provide, and there was different funding for that, for doing the research, but then they provide additional funding to try to help make sure that researchers do get their research findings out there into the hands of those who can use it. So it's kind of appropriate to be talking about things like policy briefs and ways that we can move our research findings into the hands of users as part of this session. All right.
So a little roadmap of where we're going today. We'll do a brief introduction and look at some of the policy brief requirements and exactly what they are, provide some examples, and then we'll have some insights, as Kelly mentioned, from Ken Carter and Wade Bowers, and then hopefully some time for a bit of a Q&A.
So we thought we'd just start out with a couple of definitions, and the sources that are cited here have been provided, I think, to both classes. There are a number of good resources out there on creating policy briefs, one from the International Development Research Center and another from a food and agriculture organization here that we're citing. So the first source suggests that policy briefs present the findings and recommendations of a research project to a non-specialized audience. So I think a couple key points here. One would be findings and recommendations, and some of the other sources will acknowledge not all research lends itself well to recommendations, and not all researchers are comfortable with trying to offer policy recommendations from their research either. So that's an important thing to kind of think about up front, is whether your research is the kind of research that lends itself to recommendations, whether that's one of your goals to offer policy recommendations at the end of your project, and if so, to think about what that means in terms of what kind of information you need, and how you're going to present it. And it's generally to a non-specialized audience, so it's another key point. It's an informed audience, but not an academic audience. So that has implications for the language you use and the formatting you use and that kind of thing, which we'll talk more about. The second definition refers to a policy brief as a concise summary of a particular issue, the policy options to deal with it, and some recommendations on the best option. A distinction in the second one is it talks about presenting a range of alternatives. So some policy briefs will be more sort of suggesting this is the way you should go, where others might present a range of possible alternative ways that a government agency, for example, might go, and some pros and cons to associated with particular options. The target audience is often government policymakers, so I've already made reference several times to government policymakers as the audience for these documents, but there are other types of organizations that are also involved in making and influencing policy, such as non-government organizations, which is listed in the bullets below. And one example that I'm going to draw on later on is a drinking water project that we did, and we created 4 policy briefs. And really getting our findings into the hands of the Provincial Municipal Association, which is an NGO that represents local governments, was probably the most influential thing we could do. And that meant presenting things in a format appropriate for that NGO. And because then they had much more influence than we would as a researcher on the political decision makers. So sometimes the goal is to get it into the hands of others who can advocate or require information to advocate for policy change versus directly into the hands of, or maybe as well as into the hands of government decision makers, which may include elected officials or senior policy advisors, for example. I liked this quote from one of the resources that I provided was from the European Commission, called Communicating Research for Evidence-Based Policy Making, a practical guide for researchers in socioeconomic sciences and humanities. And they suggest that of all the publications a research project produces, the policy brief is one of the most likely to be read first in policymaking circles. And if you can succeed in capturing a decision maker's interest with a policy brief, your findings have a good chance of entering the policy debate. So again, if your goal is to try to influence policy through your research, then this quote and source would argue that this is the probably the most important kind of document that you can produce. And finally, for turning it over to Heather, the key goals of a policy brief are to provide enough background for the reader to understand the problem. So we'll get into the elements of it, but the background has to include both why they should care about this issue, why this issue is important, but also the background that you've gathered, the knowledge that you have been able to add to the understanding of the problem from your research. You want to convince the reader that this is important, and that's particularly important right up front on the first page of the brief. And hopefully the reader is already interested in your topic, but you also need to convince them that your particular topic within their general area is critical. Provide information about alternatives in an objective brief, so the alternatives have to be based on good, solid research, and provide evidence to support an alternative in a brief that is, if the goal is to advocate for a particular kind of change. As I mentioned earlier, it may be not, so the more objective brief would be to present some alternatives and leave it up to the decision makers with the evidence you've given them to decide what the best route would be. Or you may be pushing for a particular option, in which case you need to provide the evidence to support that option. And then hopefully your brief also pushes the reader towards making some kind of change, some kind of decision. Because clearly if there's a brief being made, there's a need for some kind of a change to happen.
Excellent. So in terms of the requirements of the policy brief, we're going to run through each of these kind of keywords we have up on the slide. The first is that it's focused, and what we really mean here is that all aspects of the policy brief, from its message to how it looks, its layout, needs to be strategically focused on achieving that intended goal of convincing your target audience, of either providing those alternative solutions or recommendations or really advocating for one particular recommendation. The second key point to keep in mind is that it's evidence-based. So this is a communication tool that's often produced by policy analysts, or from a researcher standpoint, we're trying to get our research into the hands of policymakers. And so the potential audiences not only expect a very rational argument, but will only be convinced by evidence that the problem exists and that the consequences of adopting particular alternatives are backed by evidence. Another kind of key point to keep in mind is that a policy brief needs to be succinct, and there's various page limits that you'll see in the literature. Generally, it's not more than 10, but I think the average is between 6 to 8. And really what you're aiming here is that policymakers increasingly do not have a lot of time or perhaps the desire to read an in-depth 50-page or 100-page report on a policy problem. And so what you really want to do is provide that succinct description of what it is the key issue, and some of those alternative solutions that they can easily read, hopefully within 10 minutes. You want it to be understandable. So you want there to be clear and simple language, so avoid the use of jargon or concepts from a particular discipline or field. But you also want to provide a well-explained and easy-to-follow argument that targets a wide but knowledgeable audience. You want it to be accessible, so you want the document to be easy to read. So you should use clear subheadings and titles to help guide the reader through the policy brief. In some instances, you might want to make it a little bit promotional. And what we mean here is that you want it to catch the eye of your potential reader and leave a favorable impression with them. So it looks professional, perhaps it looks innovative in its layout. You'll see that many policy briefs, they use a lot of color. They use logos, perhaps photographs. They might use other graphs to visualize data, illustrative quotes throughout, so that it really draws the reader in and really gives a polished feel when you look at it. And then finally, you want it practical and feasible. So this is really an action-oriented tool that targets policy practitioners. And as a result, you want to provide arguments that are based on what is actually happening in practice with a particular policy, and propose recommendations which seem realistic to the target audience. So you want people to walk away thinking that there is something they can do about this issue, and you've provided those recommendations on where they can go with it. In terms of the typical structure of a policy brief, we often see a title or a title bar, and something to keep in mind. You want this to be short but catchy. You want people to look at it and you want them to be intrigued and you want them to continue reading it. Oftentimes, the policy brief includes an executive summary or perhaps some key messages or highlights. If you're going the key messages and highlights route, oftentimes these are presented in bullets. Typically 4 to 5 that have a little bit more meat, so you might see 1 or 2 sentences for each bullet. And this is for those who are really busy or perhaps in a bit of a rush and can't read the whole brief. They can walk away with the gist of your message in that executive summary or your key highlights. Then you want to get into the issue at hand, and this is kind of introducing the policy challenge or issue. You then look at kind of the body or the description and provide that knowledge base of what we know about that policy issue. And then you want to provide those recommendations or perhaps some of the policy implications of what you've taken away from that knowledge base or that discussion of what the issue is. Depending on the topic, these recommendations or policy implications, you may want to order them in a thematic way, perhaps geographically or institutionally. So you might have specific recommendations for specific actors, whether it be municipal governments, NGOs, the federal government, the provincial government, depending on what those recommendations are. And then some might have some conclusions, but oftentimes the conclusions are kind of wrapped up in those recommendations. In terms of building an effective policy brief, there's a few things to keep in mind. The first is to examine the issue you will be dealing with and answer questions like, is the issue general or is it something that's specific? And if it's general, how general is it? Does it impact everyone or specific organizations? And if it's specific, also think about how specific that is. Is it particular to a certain region or only to a specific level of government? Then you want to think about your audience, and you really want to take that primary audience into serious consideration. So your brief really needs to be catered to them and tailored to them. So you want to use language that they will be familiar with. You want it to be presented in a way that they will be familiar with, and you want the recommendations to really reflect things that they can do. And so it's really fundamental for how you frame your analysis and your recommendations. And you want to think about whether it's perhaps an individual. So maybe your target is the Prime Minister and you're trying to create a policy brief just for the Prime Minister, or perhaps it's an organization like the entire federal government or the entire provincial government or territorial government. You then want to think about the relevant actors for the issue that you are dealing with. And you can also think of actors in terms of stakeholders, people who might have a vested interest in this particular topic or in your policy recommendations. And this is really an essential step, since you have to analyze their interests in order to make sensible and viable policy recommendations. And when you identify the relevant actors, this will allow you to produce a good assessment of the context and of their interests. And that's the next kind of area that you want to look at. So when you're thinking about what those actors' interests are, or those key stakeholders, you want to look at which of the relevant stakeholders or actors have similar interests to your target audience. Perhaps they have different interests, so you'll want to identify that. You'll also want to think about why they're different or how different they are. And this step is really important both for the context or that description part of your brief, but also for when you're starting to develop those policy options or recommendations. Without a clear identification of who the actors are involved in the issue and their interests, your brief could risk being too vague and therefore not useful to any of your audience or your actors. In terms of recommendations, you want those to reflect the analysis that you've been building throughout. And remember that according to the issue and the audience, your recommendations might not suggest the best policy, but instead the most viable one. So this shouldn't limit you to just thinking about what we often call compromise policies, when we can't have the best, but we can perhaps have something in the middle. But you need to think about what's within our capabilities, or what's within that audience's key capabilities. That's not to say you shouldn't recommend radical changes. You may always want to throw one in just in case it could potentially get taken up. But remember that radical action has to be implemented in some way. So you'll want to give some advice on how perhaps those radical recommendations could be implemented. A number of policy briefs also get into how-tos. So it kind of takes it a little bit more specific than the recommendation, and really gives them the next step on how they should go about doing this, and perhaps who should be in charge of doing it. And then one final tool, if you're still kind of stuck on how to start thinking about your issue, or perhaps taking your research, is you can use an approach called what, so what, now what. And so when we look at what, it's really thinking about what is the issue, who are those stakeholders, who is that audience, so what, why is it important, why should they care, what are the implications, and a short background of that issue. And then now what are the recommendations, what do we do now, who does what. So if you're really stuck on trying to frame it, you can try plugging your research or your topic into this and see where it takes you in terms of some policy recommendations. In terms of what policy briefs are not, they are not original research papers. So you're not going out and you're not doing 50 key informant interviews or a questionnaire to try and convince the readers. You may be taking information from research that you've done and putting it into a policy brief, but you're not framing it in the same way that you would write a research paper. So along those lines, it's not focused on methods, so you won't be discussing all of the things you did to get that information. And you obviously want it, as we've mentioned, short and to the point. So you want to avoid that technical language, and you really want to only use evidence and research that are going to support the argument that you're trying to make. So we'll turn it over to Kelly, who's going to explain a few examples on policy briefs.
Great. And just one thing I wanted to do before I did that is one of the resources that we made available through OMAFRA, Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, also talked about presenting the brief, which I thought would be important to mention. So what do you do with the brief once you've created it? You need to actually find a way to get it into the hands of the right people. And so one approach is, of course, just to mail it to somebody and hope that it ends up in the right hands. But that's not the most strategic thing to do. So they suggest it's important to find out who the gatekeepers are. Is there an administrative assistant who handles all the communications, for example? Find out who that is. Contact them and ask them how many copies should they make should you make available. Get some advice on the best way to get that brief into the hands of the right person. They also suggest that you may be given the opportunity to present a brief, or you could ask for the opportunity to present the brief. So rather than just having the paper brief available, to ask to be able to present that. So you can find out more about that, and then of course be aware of how long, what the expectations would be for such a presentation if you're given that opportunity. And make the brief available to people ahead of time that are going to be present. And they suggested never read the brief, which I thought was an important point too. So assuming they've got the brief, you're wanting to give highlights and additional insights. So I thought that was an important point, just worth going over. So you've got this beautiful brief that does everything that it should. It still might not have the results that you want if you're not getting it into the right hands and presenting it in the best way. They also suggest that you think about a team approach. Whoever wrote the brief might not be the same person who actually presents the brief. If you've got a group, you want to get your best, most powerful presenter to do that presentation, for example. So a couple of examples that I wanted to bring up. One was the Europa research. So I thought it was interesting. One of the resources is from the European Commission, and there also seems to be an emphasis on the creation of policy briefs in quite a bit of the European research, which is interesting. I don't think that, I haven't noticed anyway, that we have the same kind of emphasis on making those kinds of resources available within our Canadian research institutions. So as I said, there is a connections grant available. Here, I'm going to try to pull that up. I thought I had it there. But I haven't noticed the use of the policy brief as a way of sharing research to the same extent. I'm just trying to pull this up here. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So can you see that, Heather?
Yep.
Okay, great. So just I wanted to show that as an example. I think some of the things that Heather, that we've mentioned, the logo, for example, European Union's there. They've got an attractive photograph. They're using color, certainly. A lot of white space as well, so we tend to fill our documents with a lot of text. Whereas an effective brief, I think that kind of the design is really important. So thinking about having someone who's good at graphic design on your team, speaking of your team, again,
That's me.
okay, good. Well,
There's a degree in graphic
you want Michelle on your team. They've got the introduction and objectives out front there. The header that has a title, but also a little bit of text behind the title is there as well to give the really quick snapshot. Let's see what else I wanted to pull out here. There is a methodology section, which actually is more extensive than some that I see. So they're all a little different, is another point to make. I've looked at a number of examples in preparing for this, and there's not a magic recipe, but it certainly gets to the point quickly about the major findings, uses graphics, and as Heather had suggested, let me see here, I'm just going to jump to the recommendations. This is the key messages. So we talked about how some of the briefs are more about very specific policy recommendations, and a lot of materials recommend that the recommendations are quite specific. But this is obviously an example where what they were wanting to do is more draw out some research findings that have policy implications. So they're not really suggesting any particular recommendations. So that could be seen as a criticism of this brief, I would say, because certainly most of the sources that I looked at, it'd be interesting to hear what Ken and Wade have to say about this, but suggests that the decision makers are going to be looking pretty quickly for what is it you want me to do here? So this particular brief doesn't really offer that. They also suggest the importance of having the contact information on there, a little bit about who's involved in this, and how, if they do want to follow up, those that are reading the brief, who they would speak to. So I think that's an important point. The next example I wanted to draw from was one from our own research on drinking water systems in the province. So we did, well, really the research continues, and a number of the people in the class are following up on some of the research findings. We've been working on research related to drinking water systems since 2013 now, and well, even some smaller projects before that, but we did a major project on challenges associated with drinking water systems, particularly for small communities in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador in 2013, 14, and into 2015. And we created 4 policy briefs out of that project. I have some copies here, not in color, but for those that are in the room. And the website is on the slides for those in Heather's class. But you'll see some of the characteristics that we talked about, although certainly I myself have just been, I've done a couple of sets of policy briefs around our major research projects, but I wouldn't, certainly don't consider myself an expert in creating them. We're learning as we go. But the summary is there, that short summary of what the brief says, in case the reader doesn't want to read any further. It's there. We tried to use some colors, not as vibrant as the red, but the photograph that's there, rather than a project, we didn't have a project logo, but we used that image of the pump house station there, which is the sort of typical water infrastructure for a small town, Newfoundland and Labrador, on all of our reports. So it was a sort of a signature image for the project. And just walk through it a little bit here. The background, areas of concern. So what is it that decision makers should be concerned about here? In this case, we also clustered the recommendations. So Heather mentioned that the 4 briefs were around different aspects of drinking water systems. So this was about the actual water infrastructure and the operation of that infrastructure, whereas we had another brief on drinking water supply and protecting drinking water supplies, another one on public awareness, and a fourth on governance and decision-making around water systems. So this is the infrastructure one. Tried to highlight certain concerns, such as the lack of trained water operators in the province, with this graphic to say one of the reasons why infrastructure isn't being operated as well or maintained as well as it should be is because of issues around certified water operators and training. And some of the practices are highlighted here. And then we had a series of recommendations. So you can see there's 10 recommendations in total here presented, what I hope is fairly clearly, although we certainly worked a lot on how specific the recommendations should be. And I think that there's always a tension between researchers who want to qualify everything, not be too specific in terms of recommendations. Often we're worried about being too specific because we recognize the importance of context, for example. One solution might not work everywhere. Those are the kinds of things we want to say, whereas a decision maker might want, tell me what I could do to fix the problem everywhere, kind of a solution. But we tried to be as specific as we could in these recommendations in these briefs. I mentioned that the NGO, Municipality of Newfoundland and Labrador, was a critical audience for these briefs, but also we did a report for municipalities. So again, targeting. These were more meant for provincial decision makers, these particular documents. There was also a report meant for municipal leaders and series of things for the municipal leaders, actually presentations, other resources. Those steps resulted in a series of resolutions that fed into the province as well as our briefs. So one of the things I think Ken will probably talk about is it's hard to prove impact on policy because there's many different things that influence policy, and it's hard to show causality. My policy brief resulted in this change. So we went with our briefs at provincial policymakers. We worked with the Municipal Association, who also were working with the provincial policymakers, and there were other actors as well. But there was a result in terms of all of this work. A number of the resolutions that MNL put forward, which were based on our recommendations. So our recommendations went to the Provincial Municipal Association. They passed a series of resolutions, which were passed by all the municipalities in the province. Based on those recommendations, those resolutions went into the province, and a number of those resolutions have been acted on with various new standard operating procedures, pilot projects around regional water operators, for example, new maintenance assurance manual. So there were a number of concrete changes in drinking water systems operations that resulted from this. So we think that there was at least some effectiveness to this strategy. I have a letter here from the Premier that he sent, but a lot of that's probably pretty standard. I think, Ken or Ray can speak to that, but we sent the briefs with an accompanying letter to all of the relevant minister's office, so the Minister of Municipal Affairs, Environment and Conservation, Department of Health, who all have some involvement in water, as well as to the Premier himself, and to the opposition parties, because we were in the middle of an election period in fall 2015. So we thought, well, we could get the pressure coming from all directions on the change. So we did get responses from the Premier directly, thanking us for the work and talking about their commitments to moving forward and looking at the issues. So that's great. And I just thought that was a good example of something we've done. This was in fall of 2015. So it's now getting a bit older. So it's time for a new set of policy briefs, but it's a concrete example. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we pass it over to Ken and Wade? All right, I'm going to stop sharing then the screen. We can see each other again. Danielle's back. Hi, Danielle.
Hi.
You okay to hang in there for a little bit longer?
Yep, I'm just back to ask if you want me to turn off the recording now.
I think, well, Ken, how would you feel? Do you prefer we turn the recording off, or are you okay with sharing the thoughts?
Well, I don't know in terms of Wade's comments.
Well, when Wade, I thought you'd go first if you're comfortable with it, and then we'll turn it off before Wade adds his comments.
Where does it go?
Well, amongst other students and members of our research team.
Yeah. Fine.
Okay, go ahead, go for it.
But yeah, I think Wade actually signed a thing at the executive level that I never did, so I guess I can say what I want. Or it can be recorded. Wait,
What's that, Danielle?
It's hard to see Ken because of where he's sitting. If he could move up a little bit.
which way?
Shift, yeah, that way probably.
Okay.
You see him now?
I can see him now.
Yeah, so I worked with the Rural Secretariat, which was part of the provincial government. This Rural Secretariat was set up in 2005 as an entity of the provincial government to give advice to the provincial government related to, particularly around policy, related to rural issues facing, so it's been very difficult times for rural for quite a while, and the response of the newly elected Conservative government in 2004 was to suggest that they would set up this entity that would speak to and engage with citizens in rural places and try to get advice into government. One of the things that was undertaken was a rural lens was added, which continues, but this dated back to around 2005, 2006, and the rural lens was any sort of policy briefing materials, particularly cabinet papers, had to talk about how impacts on rural places of a particular form of action were undertaken, and that continues to happen today. So that's one of the things that came out of that. But there was the main sort of policy contribution in a way, besides the rural lens, was a series of policy briefs or advice documents from 9 regional councils that were set up with the provincial government. And over a span of 10 or so years, there were about 60 or so advice documents actually prepared and sent into particular ministers. So some of them would go to a specific minister, some, depending on what they were about, would go to 1 or 2 or 3 ministers or more. And they would be asked specific, and they were asked, so the councils were asked to give this advice, and then those documents were put together and sent in. What we found early on was it was very difficult to get the advice from the councils. So at first we had very few documents. Over time, we sort of did a lot of work with these councils, particularly around training and public engagement, and suggesting that we would support them as they move forward to engage citizens and others and community groups in their region, so that a document would sort of more broadly reflect a series of people in the region. The other thing was that we worked to incorporate a community-based research project program. So we ended up doing about 40 or so community-based research projects. I think Kelly was involved in about 10 or 15 of those, with graduate students putting documents forward on behalf of councils to help them make a stronger case for the policy advice they wanted to actually. Yeah, that's right. Probably the last one.
Yeah, the last. Yeah, no advice document was ever.
The councils no longer exist. They were disbanded, I think, in late 2015 or 2016 by the current Liberal administration. So I think what we did a developmental evaluation of the process of giving advice, and I think there's some interesting stuff in there, and the experience of going through all this, we learned, and it's maybe a little bit different. Some of it overlaps with the discussion that we've been having and the points that Kelly and Heather have raised, but some of it is more just like dealing with how stuff gets dealt with when you give it to government people. And sometimes it can be one of the, when we interview deputy ministers and others and ask them, what did you think, what happened when you got that document, sort of after the fact, years, in some cases years later. And specific deputy ministers would say things like, we didn't know what to do, we didn't know who was giving it to us. And this was an internally developed provincial government process. So you can imagine if you're sort of shooting something in from outside, it's probably even worse. Which suggests that you want to be very careful about maybe building some social capital with the department you're trying to send it to. Maybe visiting and finding out who is it you're getting it to. Because if you just sort of bombs away on your email to someone who appears to be the appropriate person. Maybe it's the minister, maybe it's someone else. That can often lead to a shift quickly. Is this going to cause us, damage control? And we had specific deputy ministers who said that's how we reacted when we got these documents. We went into damage control mode. So, and from the perspective of the advice documents that we were doing, we thought in order to avoid that kind of response, what do you need to do? Well, I'm just trying to find, I had some notes written down specifically about that. I can't find them. But so include broader engagement. I mentioned that with stakeholders and public, and show that you've actually gone out and people agree with you on this topic. Include research and evidence, and I think this was well covered already. Consider issues that have a broad kind of, because it's more difficult to implement a policy that is specific to a particular place. If you want a decision made about a particular project, that's fine. But if you want things that are much more broadly implementable, then you do need to think about at what level you're giving that advice and what you want to do. The other thing that was already mentioned was clearly outlining and articulating solutions. I think that's important. Also, while it's important to engage with people in your, sort of field in your region, build a coalition, that sort of things, particularly, as Kelly said, an example like MNL where there's regular interaction and these things can find a way directly on to the minister's desk, and there's a process in place for doing that. If there isn't anything like that, then you're in kind of a more difficult situation. But building that, so engaging with officials in advance of giving them this document can be an important point, and actually building a rapport and getting initial feedback. Even say when you're sort of saying, this is sort of what we're thinking about. Are there any, reasons why this is going to be just thrown in the waste paper basket? We've already thought about this. We don't believe this is going to work. This is not a policy option for us. You'd be better if you knew that in advance and maybe sort of tried to come up with strategies for overcoming that sort of
Which
Which
is
is
about, Heather mentioned the point about feasible recommendations.
Yeah.
You won't know that necessarily unless you're engaging in conversation. And I just want to add, because in case I came across as it was a sort of adversarial relationship between our water research team and the province, it wasn't. They were involved in our advisory committee, and there was ongoing communication throughout.
Yeah.
And so that's a really important part of
Absolutely.
the change, I think, too.
So, and then that example, you've got clear discussions happening. We had other ones where a council would put together an advice document, no forewarning, and then sort of straight onto the minister's desk. And it would often then end up in the communications hands, and they're basically then trying to damage, sort of control and trying to figure out how to make this go away. And we had deputy ministers sort of just say that essentially, because they didn't even understand that it was an internal process. So there's a whole, how do you actually avoid that sort of thing? And largely by good communications with people who can actually guide your policy document and make sure it gets in the right hands versus the wrong hands. So champions on both sides to advance the document that you're working on. Wade, do you want to jump in at about anything, or?
Well, maybe if Danielle, I know Danielle has to leave at 5 anyway, so if there's are you still there, Danielle?
Oh, right, because you're.
Yeah, we can shut the recording off if she's.
It's okay. How's your time going?